cross and empty tomb. It remains now to look more closely at the canonical portrayal to see how Jerome could speak, as he did, of a gospel army and of the Logos, Jesus at work at its head, thus resisting by instinct any effort to sentimentalize Jesus or his own special moral teaching in the manner of what we've come to see in the 18th and 19th century liberal Protestantism. So now I want to broaden the canonical lens just a bit further from Joshua, Judges, and Deuteronomy particularly. The larger narrative context, of course, in which accounts of Herem occur is what is usually called the Deuteronomistic history. This narrative is comprised of the book of Deuteronomy from the Pentateuch and the former prophets consisting of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. I can leave Ruth to the side for a moment. Martin Note's famous explanation for the composition, collation, and final editing of this history I've already touched upon, and we've heard about it in different forms at this conference. The history tells why Israel was sent into exile. Despite the warning of prophets to obey the law, and in spite of the exemplary conduct of a few individual kings to whom God had given promises of long-standing trust and commitment, Israel's disobedience finally led to the destruction of Jerusalem and the exiling of its population. Others argued against Note for more ameliorating notes here and there. It would be nice to have a few in the overall thrust of the history, and views of redactional supplements and additions are not without their proponents. But the basic theory has held. The Deuteronomistic history is a narrative and must be understood narratively. The separation of Deuteronomy from the history to serve now as the final book of the foundational Pentateuch has also been viewed as significant. The law given at Sinai is for generations to come. Moses is the first and foremost of a succession of prophets who are referred to in the history and in the prophetic books proper. And finally, Deuteronomy serves to reflect on the failure of the past generation and the anticipated failure and punishment of the generations to come, with a promise that God will forgive and that the law's good force will remain forever. Seen in this light, Joshua describes the model successor to Moses, and we've already heard Nick and others speak of this ritualized, as it were, model account. And it gives indication of successful and also unsuccessful efforts to live into God's promises, which include the destruction of the Canaanites as a threat to these promises. The opening chapters of Judges focus on the piecemeal and incomplete settlement of the tribes of Israel after the death of Joshua. Here we read a candid account that states what was not accomplished. Manasseh did not drive out. Ephraim did not drive out. Zebulun did not drive out. Asher did not drive out. Naphtali did not drive out. Chapter 2 in Judges serves as a moralizing introduction to all that follows in this book, picking up on the effects of leaving gods of various kinds round about them through the failure to do what God had commanded. Now for Israel there is what? Defeat in battle, plundering from the nations, abandonment by God into the power of their enemies. They were, in the lapidary phrase of Judges 2:15, in sore straits. God will not drive out nations now. He will send judges whose positive effects will be shown to be temporary, if not tragic. The nations are left then as a test, and for the most part, Israel will fail that test. The book of Judges ends with a somber announcement. Now every man did what was right in his or her own eyes. There was no king in the land. The vortex of sin and punishment is inescapable, and Israel is locked in its grip. 1 Samuel opens with these same notes of despair and desuetude. The priesthood is corrupt. Judges cannot resolve the situation. Kingship requires a different model than Israel or the nations even have dreamed about. Hannah sees into a hopeful future of restabilization, though the reason for that and the character of the resolution are locked in the mysterious counsels and timing of God. The book of Ruth has two locations in the canon, in the writings, and also between Judges and Samuel, and in my view was intended to be a book whose logic enables it to migrate. In the writings, Ruth follows Proverbs and provides a narrative account of the ideal wife as described in Proverbs' last chapter. Boaz describes Ruth in exactly these terms, but the writings are books which canon do migrate in many Christian lists because the writings are a diverse collection and their internal organization is not critical to their interpretation in the same way as books in the law and the prophets. Placed, therefore, inside the Deuteronomistic history following Judges, Ruth shows the faithfulness of the non-Israelite, whose trust in the God of Israel saves not just her mother's property, but provides her and her mother both with children. The genealogy, which the book closes with, locates the courageous action of the Moabitess Ruth within the salvation history, and that history is traced back to Genesis, to another heroic non-Israelite, namely Tamar the Canaanite, who before the descent into Egypt had preserved the line of Judah. Now, in the midst of a vortex of judgment almost as severe as the exterminating opening chapters of Exodus, Ruth preserves the line again. The sojourner in the midst of Israel becomes the preserver of Israel's future life and hope, as the son born to her and Naomi becomes the great-grandfather of the king who will reverse for a season the dark period of disobedience. Ruth is not a Canaanite, though her line goes back through Boaz to Tamar, but a Moabite. She is not a nation to be driven out, but as Israel is driven out in famine and in loss, Ruth the Moabitess returns with her mother-in-law and so becomes a blessing. She to Israel and Israel to her in fulfillment of the promises spoken long ago to Abraham. Harem, it seems to me, must be considered within this long account of how God shows himself to be faithful to his promises, both with Israel and through them to the nations. It exists in narrative form, does this practice, and narrative requires attention, as we know from basic English courses, to the long story and its details. An account of Deuteronomy and Joshua, which is divorced from Judges and Ruth, will only give us isolated verses, isolated episodes, and it will not do sufficient justice to the personal character of God, which must be seen over the course of time through punishment, death, new life, and promised even miraculous futures. Obviously, the church fathers did not read harem in the context of democratic concerns, but rather they saw it as comprehensible only from the standpoint of the character of God. But in turn, that character could not be grasped by them apart from a full account of God's life with Israel and the nations, and not addressed to simple episodes here, there, and everywhere. There is no access to an account of God as loving, as we often, I think, theorize, absent an account of his justice and holiness, and vice versa. This dialectic is so absolutely central to the account of God in Old Testament and New Testament that it cannot be spliced into segments, the one more persuasive than the other, and so more salutary and capable of commending trust. Trust comes in the biblical account of this from an encounter with a living God who tears down and brings life both. If it's true that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, then such wisdom is as much a function of being grasped by God's holiness as it is weighing accounts of his activity and deciding for or against him. If God were to belong to this latter frame of reference, he would not be the biblical God. He would be a God of moral projection. And then the questions would be, whose morality and whose justice? The scriptures of Israel, therefore, make no distinction between mercy and justice when it comes to fearing God. It belongs to God's character as God. That mystery lies at the heart of mercy and justice. So the psalmist can conclude, with thee is mercy and forgiveness, therefore you are to be feared. Consistent with this, it should be borne in mind that the authority of the Old Testament for the early fathers was conveyed, most of them Gentiles coming to this literature from outside, that the authority of the Old Testament for these fathers was conveyed precisely through the text that spoke of things like harem. For them, it is primarily the life and death character of God's work in Israel that indicates the character of him as God alone. The concern of the early church and the tradition was not with God's life as morally upright and so worthy of our attention or respect, whatever that might mean, for it was not possible to understand morality apart from God's revealed character and will. The greater concern was with acknowledging his identity as over against false gods and seeking better to live within a life given anew by him. That life and death character is experienced from Israel's standpoint, in the promise to deliver from a situation of extermination, such as we see at the beginning of Exodus with the Pharaoh's murder of the Hebrew boys. But it immediately manifests itself within Israel as a threat, as much as a promise. So Moses' hand is leprous and then whole. There's a night encounter to kill Moses, death of a generation in the wilderness. In these contexts, what might it mean to speak of God as morally good or morally deficient? God's character is experienced in acts of promise and fulfillment, but always set against a backdrop of moral seriousness of the highest order, whose lineaments are difficult to follow. The revelation of the name of God is a personal encounter with him as he shows himself to be the Lord, gracious and merciful. Moses is reassured when God promises life and relationship in the midst of death and broken fellowship. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it is in the context of a somber reassurance of God's presence and holiness and awe that the author of Exodus speaks what we might refer to in this conference about the morality of God, though the term would be, I think, quite foreign to him, of God making my goodness pass before Moses. I will make not goodness, qua goodness, but my goodness pass before you. The implication of this collocation in Exodus 33 is that goodness has a logic understood in the context of acknowledgement within a scene of death and threatened relationship.